Pranam. Before we kick off today's podcast on pension updation framework under BPR 35.1, if you're watching this, you're already part of our community. Please subscribe to get notified of new podcasts when they drop.
Subscription is totally free and it encourages YouTube algorithm to promote our podcasts to many more retirees. Thank you.
So today we're diving into a world that's intricate, mathematical, and deeply human. The complex inner workings of bank employee pensions. I'm Nisha Bhattacharya and my co-host is Priyanka Chakraborty.
And for this analysis, we are pulling from a very specific, very revealing stack of sources.
First up, we have an extract from the BPR pension regulations.
That's Appendix 1, Regulation 35.
Yes. Regulation 35 defines the exact formula for updating older pensions alongside detailed comparative charts from the Mysore pensioners.
Lots of data in those.
Oh, tons of data. And finally, we have a brief analytical note simply titled The Updation Formula.
Our goal is to decode these pensions, showing how the era of retirement can radically shape a worker's financial fate for life.
It really is night and day depending on the year.
We'll break down how inflation multipliers work and what updation truly means for retirees navigating this maze.
Because it really is a labyrinth.
This isn't dry data, it's a mathematical drama shaping real lives, determining the daily survival of those who built these institutions.
Look at the scale of the math and you see it. A pension isn't static. It's a living equation battling time and inflation.
A living equation, I like that.
Let's unpack the rulebook. Regulation 35 lays out a laser-specific formula for updating pensions.
It covers employees retiring between Jan 1986 and October 1987, and their pensions weren't based on a flat slice of final pay.
No, that would be too simple.
Way too simple. They used a highly fragmented tiered system.
Right. According to the document, you get 50% of the first 1,000 rupees of your average emoluments.
And then they drop down for the next check.
Yeah. Then you get 45% of the next 500 rupees and finally 40% of anything exceeding 1,500 rupees.
To really grasp that, we should define what the document means by average emoluments, reckonable for pension. It wasn't just your take-home pay on your final day.
It was more complicated.
Much more. It was a very specific calculation of your base pay plus certain eligible allowances, and they averaged it over the last 10 months you were in service.
So it's this 10-month rolling average.
Exactly. And the tiered system, the 50% here, 45% there, it was designed to provide a slightly higher proportional safety net for lower wage earners.
Yes.
But that initial sum is just the very first part of the equation.
Right, because 1,000 rupees in 1986 is vastly different from 1,000 rupees a decade later.
Let alone in 2026.
Exactly. So the document introduces dearness relief. For this specific 1986 to 1987 bracket, the dearness relief was pegged at an index number of 600.
And the text notes that index is based on the All India Average Consumer Price Index for industrial workers.
Oh, I see.
The Industrial Worker Index was the most robust, frequently updated data set the government used to track the rising cost of basic everyday goods.
Things like rice, fuel, clothing, and housing.
Exactly. That index was the gold standard for inflation, so white-collar sectors like banking simply used it to set their cost of living shifts.
The regulations dig even deeper. The basic pension was fixed on November 193 with a rule to round it up to the next rupee.
And we can't forget the Carve Outs.
Right? The rules carve out specifics, only allowances feeding the provident fund count toward additional pension.
But only under very strict conditions.
Yes, only under the terms of the Bipartite Settlement dated April 10th, 1989.
The Provident Fund is the mandatory savings scheme where both the employee and the employer contribute a portion of the salary.
It's the foundation for the corpus retirees like to refer to.
It is, but the need to codify which allowances fed the fund tied to a precise 1989 date shows the meticulous, exhausting detail required to track every rupee.
It's just layer upon layer of bureaucracy.
It paints a picture of a system built on a highly rigid, date-locked mathematical foundation. The math functioned perfectly for the exact moment it was written.
But time marches on.
Exactly. But as the decades roll on, that rigidity begins to cause enormous structural strain.
Which brings us perfectly to the next set of sources, the comparative pension charts.
These are fascinating.
Because in the banking industry, time isn't just measured in years, it is measured in bipartite settlements or BPS.
These wage agreements are negotiated across the industry. The Mysore pensioners' charts span an extraordinary timeline showing how each settlement shaped pensions.
They start all the way back at the 6th BPS and go right up to the 12th BPS.
What's fascinating here is the massive inverse relationship between a retiree's basic pension and their dearness relief percentage based on when they retired.
Inverse meaning, the older the pension, the higher the relief percentage.
Exactly. The basic pension is the fixed amount set at retirement, while DR is the multiplier added to help that old base keep pace with today's costs.
And these charts calculate the dearness relief for a very specific recent point in time, which is February 2026.
So we are looking at current day numbers.
Right, let's look at the newest retirees first, the people who retired under the baseline 12th BS. Their base pension reflects modern salaries, so the dearness relief added on top is just 25%.
Which is a relatively modest bump to handle recent short-term inflation.
Exactly. But step back just a single era to the 11th BPS, and the dearness relief jumps up to 59.08%.
And it doesn't stop there. Step back one more era to the 10th BPS, and suddenly that multiplier is at 32.2%.
So the multiplier more than doubles their base pension just to keep them afloat.
And it accelerates aggressively the further back in time you go.
It really does. Look at this. The 9th BPS requires a dearness relief of 258.45%. The 8th BPS requires a 354.8% multiplier.
And then we hit the most extreme numbers in the charts.
If you retired under the 7th BPS, your multiplier is 482.84%. For 6th BPS pioneers, the dearness relief soars to an astonishing 750.75%.
A 750% inflation multiplier. The system is desperately trying to bridge a widening chasm between the economy of the 1980s and the economy of the 2020s.
It's telling to consider older retirees have such tiny base pensions that they need massive percentage boosts just to survive inflation, decade after decade.
It's like patching an old operating system. Multiplying a 1986 pension by 750% is like trying to run 2026 software on a 1986 computer, but just adding more and more external hard drives.
That is a great analogy.
A 750% multiplier sounds huge on paper, but when we look at the gross amounts in this chart, the reality hits hard.
Yeah, because even with a multiplier of 7.5, that 1980s base is so tiny that the final payout barely covers basic modern expenses.
Eventually, adding multipliers isn't enough.
The foundation itself, the base pension, needs a complete system update. The charts visualize this perfectly.
The dearness relief has to work harder and harder the older the pension gets, but it's fundamentally multiplying a number that is detached from modern economic reality.
Here's where it gets interesting. You have to shift from big percentages to actual pension amounts. The Mysore pensioners didn't make these charts just to show inflation math.
Right? They had a very specific point to make.
They included a column labeled Difference from 12th BPS. Their stated goal was to show exactly where we stand compared to the newest retirees.
And what stands out in these charts is the cross-scale impact. This isn't an isolated issue for one specific pay grade or one department.
The data covers absolutely every rank in the bank
It starts at the entry level with the sub-staff and the clerks.
and charts the numbers all the way up through management from scale 1 to scale 7.
So the exact same mathematical reality applies regardless of how high up the corporate ladder you climbed.
If you were a top tier executive, a scale 7 manager, and you retired during the 6th BPS era, the data exposes something brutal.
Okay.
In 26, you get a tiny base pension plus 750.75% TR, yet still earn less than a 12th BPS scale 7 retiree.
The difference from 12th BPS column proves that older retirees are financially trailing behind their newer counterparts.
So the math simply doesn't catch the older generations up.
No, it doesn't. The base they started with was just too small, so even multiplying it by 7.5 isn't enough to equal the starting line of a modern retiree.
Your entire career, decades of leadership, responsibility, and institutional stewardship, was valued less in retirement than what today's mid career officers receive automatically. And that's not rhetoric, it's arithmetic.
But simply because one person was born earlier and retired in an earlier BPS era, they are locked into a lower gross income for the rest of their life.
No matter how high the inflation multipliers climb.
This explains why pensioner groups publish this data. Those columns show a documented financial gap between generations doing the same work.
It highlights a structural failure in relying solely on dearness relief to manage long term inflation.
Absolutely.
So, what does this mean? The math is failing and multipliers aren't closing the gap. Our final source, a brief analytical note, zeroes in on a possible fix.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire conversation in these communities right now is centered around one concept, and that is updation.
The updation formula outlines the proposed fix for this generational gap.
And critically, updation will hinge on each retiree's bipartite settlement year.
Meaning they aren't just going to tinker with the inflation multiplier, rather, they will update the base pension itself.
Exactly.
Instead of a 1980s base and 750% DR, updation rebuilds your pension as if you retired in today's economy.
It's the system update we flagged earlier, outlining when the new basic pension could actually take effect,
The WEF dates,
noting with effect from the proposed WEF dates for this new anchor are November 1st, 2012, November 1st, 2017, or November 2022.
right.
If you suddenly mandate that a 1986 retiree must be paid as if they retired in 2022, you are forcing the banks to recalculate past liabilities and take a massive hit to their current balance sheets.
Which explains the different proposed dates.
Exactly. That is why the dates in the document 2012, 2017, 2022 are so critical. Moving the base to 2022 is the ideal scenario for the pensioners, achieving true generational parity.
But moving it only to 2012 might be the financial compromise the banks are pushing for.
Precisely. It updates the base but doesn't fully close the gap to the 12th BPS.
That context makes the tone of this final source document so much more impactful. The author writes, "Let us hope for the best. However, some increase in pension is evident."
It is a highly measured, cautious statement.
It is. They know the math is undeniable and the charts prove the inequality, so an increase is evident. The system has to break or bend, but they are also deeply aware of the massive accounting challenge this represents to the banks.
It carries the voice of someone who spent decades battling a complex bureaucracy, trusting their data, yet staying pragmatic about how the institution will apply updation dates.
They know that proving the math is only half the battle.
Funding it is the other.
Let's recap this journey. We've covered decades of policy, economics, and math, starting deep in the 1980s bureaucratic weeds of Regulation 35.
We looked at how early pensions were pieced together with tiered percentages, reliant on an industrial worker inflation index, and codified with highly specific provident fund carve outs from 1989.
From there, we traced how that rigid mathematical foundation collided with 40 years of inflation and reality.
And we saw how the system tried to compensate using dearness relief, leading to those staggering 750% multipliers for the oldest retirees.
Charts from the State Bank of Mysore pensioners show even huge multipliers fail. A 6th BPS retiree still earns less than a 12th BS peer of the same rank.
The generational gap is real and it is documented across every single pay scale, from sub staff all the way up to scaled executives.
Which ultimately leads to the current fiercely fought push for pension updation.
It aims to equalize pensions by pulling the base out of the 1980s and aligning it with modern BPS years like 2012 or 2022.
It is a move away from archaic patching formulas and towards genuine generational equity, despite the huge financial commitment.
It really is a massive shift in how retirees' baseline is managed.
If a system needs 700% inflation just to stand still, and still leaves a pioneer of the industry earning less than a recent retiree of the exact same rank, then locking pensions to retirement day salaries is clearly broken, right?
That's the big issue of the moment.
If the economy never stops moving, should our baseline financial anchors ever be allowed to stand still?
It challenges how we design financial security for the future, knowing how unpredictable and compounding decades of economic shift is.
Thanks for joining this data deep dive. Keep questioning, keep examining the numbers.
We'll see you on the next one.